Good morning.
Good morning.
As I look at your smiling faces, it's a privilege to be here this morning in every way. I'm filling in for Pastor Mark while he takes another week off, but it's been my privilege to fill in for him for a number of Sabbaths this year, and I don't take that lightly. To me, it's a joy to be able to interact with each other. And I hope that you're having a happy Lord's Day. So often we say happy Sabbath Day. I wonder whether it means anything different to say happy Lord's Day. Because the Sabbath, if it's just a duty, if it's something we're doing because we're doing it out of routine, but it doesn't bring us the Lord, then maybe it's not what it was meant to be. After all, he said, "By this shall all men know that you are my disciples, that you keep the Sabbath." Is that what he said? Tell me what he did say. That you have love one for another. And in my journey with you, I've been focusing on that love as love and joy and peace, but more than that. You know, there's an ad on the TV that drives me crazy sometimes where they tell you they'll give you this and that, and then they say, wait, there's more. And they'll double the offer to you. Well, there is more than just love and joy and peace. And I want to suggest that we can do some thinking today, which will take us to the sign out the front, and the car park out there, and the people inside, because I think that's where the rubber meets the road. If I can ask you to think about this statement, since this is the kind of life we have chosen, the life of the Spirit, let us make sure we don't just hold it as an idea in our heads or a sentiment in our hearts, but work out its implications in every detail of our lives. Where did I find that? It's actually a scriptural reference, but it's taken from the Message. When we talk about love and joy and peace, the more of it is there's patience and gentleness and goodness and kindness and self-control, all those things which are part of love itself. And we find the reference to that in Galatians. Where is it? Because I hope I'm not just talking to you today. I want to work with you. Galatians 5, that's it. Thank you, Michelle. And this is actually verse 25 from the Message, which has been updated these days to the New Living Translation. But I looked back at the Message and I thought what it means is that if we have the life of the Spirit in us, then we'll think about the things we do and hold them not just as ideas in our head or feelings in our heart, but we'll do something about working them out in our daily lives. Does that make sense? It has to impact the way we live. And so we've been working out of that section of Luke, which in chapter 9:51 through to 18:18 is this special section which Luke writes and gives lots of stories, which we love, but no other gospel writer gives us to them. And I've been curious about that, and so I've wanted to look at them. And we've looked at some of those stories and their impact on us. And you'll remember we talked about the prodigal family in Luke 15, We talked about the Good Samaritan in Luke 10. We talked about the widow and her request in Luke 18. And we talked about the publican and his prayer, also in that same chapter. And when I think about these people, the prodigals, the Samaritans, the widows, the publicans, what sort of people were they in Jesus' day? What sort of status or standing did they have?
Low status.
They were on the outside, weren't they? They were demeaned. They were, in many ways, rejected, or at least lower down the scale. And yet I see Jesus never gave any indication that acknowledged Jewish social stratification or status of people as important, or feared contamination by association with those rejected by it. Would you agree with that? I think that's true. It just didn't bother him because he was on a mission and he wanted to do something that was significant for people, that they might see the Father in him and what he did. And so I want today's message to take us to the story in Luke chapter 11 and verse 19. I didn't know whether Gavin would have referred to that because I didn't tell him exactly what I was going to share. But if you think of Luke here in 17 and verse 11 to 19, it's simply the story about 10 lepers. And they stood ajar from Jesus, but they called out, "Lord, help us." And then he said, "Go and show yourselves to the priests." And they did. And what happened? They were healed. We'll come back to that word healed because it's an important word. When we think of them being healed, we think of the physical change that took place in them. But one of them came back to Jesus, and he was praising God and fell at Jesus' feet. And Jesus said, "Where are the other 9? Weren't there 10 who were healed? Is there only one who's come back to say thank you, to share his gratitude?" And he says to the man, "Arise, go, your faith has saved you." Was it saved or healed? As I read it in some translations, it's both healed and saved. Because when we're healed as Jesus wants us to heal us, we are saved. The word in the original Greek is sozo, which is the word used throughout the New Testament for salvation, not for physical healing, but for salvation. Jesus recognised in the gratitude that this singular man came back. Who was he? Well, he was one of those rejected ones, for he was a Samaritan. What does that say to us? Jesus knew that these people were on the outside, but he welcomed them when they came, not only to receive healing from him, but to come on the inside with him, to be part of his journey and his life. And so when we think of his gratitude and what he did it, we have to ask ourselves, what is the motivation that Jesus is calling us to in sharing our lives with others? Motivation's a very important thing. Why we do things. In working in counselling for 15 years, I found that most people had a problem. Their simple problem was working out what they wanted most. What matters most in life. There's a subtitle on a little book that Pastor Arfi held up last week and suggested that we might want to take one and give it to friends. And on the bottom it says, what matters for a life that matters? What matters most? And I'm wondering what matters most to you. When you boil it all down, you have to prioritise some things. There are a lot of things I would like, but I have to think about what I really want most. And as we go through that process, and we think what moves us to find the things that we really want, I want to ask a question as we think of being healed and saved. How is gratitude expressed for salvation, for what Jesus gives us? We've said that salvation is assured, and you and I can be sure of that. Is that true? We say yes. We know, not because of anything good in us, but because of him and what he gave for us. And when we accept that, we're full of love and joy and peace. But our gratitude, how is that expressed? What do we actually do? And as I think of that question, I want to suggest that it's easy for us to do the right thing, to obey, to be careful in what we do, our duty, taking up our responsibility. You know, these things that you ought to do. And I can't tell you what you ought to do. And I don't think that's how Jesus wants us to feel, that we're doing what we ought to do. It ought to be, that's the wrong word. We slip into it so easily. I wonder whether it might be that we're doing things out of gratitude. If salvation is so encompassing, and that Jesus has done absolutely everything that's going to save us, then anything else we do after that, after his grace, can only be gratitude. There's no works that we do, there's no duty that we perform that attracts merit toward our salvation. It's all done. And if we're coming out of that concept, that thinking, then we want to express our gratitude. And so I want to take you back to a story we've already looked at. And in that story, as we go back, we'll find a significant word as well as significant characters, which will take us back to the heart of what I'm coming to. The story of the Good Samaritan. You know the story so well. We've heard it so often. Who are the characters in this story? Well, there were a number of them. There was a priest and a Levi, and so that's getting a bit close to me. And then there was the wounded man. And then there was the Samaritan came along. Were there any others in the story? The innkeeper. Yes, I didn't think of him, Gavin. The innkeeper. But there are two other characters in this setting that I want to look at, because this is not a factual story that Jesus is relating. It's a story he personally is telling to whom? A lawyer, a man who is really good on the law, knowing what you ought to do. And he's talking to him and he's telling this story for a reason. What might be the reason? The man knew that the law said, love your neighbour as you love God and yourself. That was very clear. But then he wanted to know, who is my neighbour? What did Jesus want to tell him? What do you think was the interaction going on between the two of them as Jesus told the story, and why did he tell it to the man? Do you think he wanted the lawyer to see himself as the Samaritan, showing mercy, doing the right thing? Or did he want him to see himself as the wounded individual laying on the ground and left for dead? Isn't that where Satan leaves us? Wounded, about to die, nobody to help us. I wonder whether Jesus' intention was that the listener, the lawyer, should see himself as both. Think about that, Linda. Which do you see yourself as? Do we have that inclination to see ourselves as the Good Samaritan, going and doing good? Or do we see ourselves as the wounded individual in desperate need of help? When I think about this, the man picked him up after he bandaged his wounds, put him on his donkey, took him to the inn, and then he said to the innkeeper, I'll give you this money, and if there's any more, I'll pay you when I come back. Who do you and I believe is coming back? Ah, that's interesting. We're Adventists. It's on the sign. We tell people that. But Jesus is going to pay anything more that needs to be paid. Doesn't that make your heart leap? Doesn't it make you grateful? Fill you with love and joy and peace, and more than that. And so as I think of that, I wonder whether this Samaritan was found by the wounded man. When he got over his wounds and he finally left the inn, do you think he went looking for the man who'd been so generous to him? Do you think he couldn't wait but to show his gratitude for this man who'd done so much for him? And when I think of that story, I need to come to Jesus and say every day, Lord, thank you. Thank you. Help me to show my gratitude, to express it in ways that you did. And so I think of Jesus at this time, and he highlighted in the story that the Samaritan took pity on the wounded man. What does that say to you when you take pity? Sometimes it's not what it should be, is it? We can feel pity, but does it really do anything for us? Sometimes I think we're in fatigue when it comes to feeling for other people. We see so many ads on the TV of people in need, and we say, oh yes, we pity them. But what do we actually do? Now, we can't save the whole world, but what does it move you and I to do? Because this word, take pity, is also in the story of the prodigal father. I call him the prodigal father because he was in the father in the story of the prodigal family. And he did the same thing, only it says he had compassion for his son. If taking pity and having compassion is the same thing, and is the same word used in the Greek, splanknesomoi, which doesn't really matter, but it's the same word, and it's used 12 times in the New Testament, and it's used every time by or about Jesus. And so I'm saying to myself, I need to think about that. What does it really mean? And if I go to other stories in the New Testament, Luke chapter 7 and verse 13, if you think of the story there, it's a widow, another widow, Jesus interacting with. It was the widow of Nain, and she was bereft because her son had died. And they were already at the funeral, and they're on their way out to bury the casket. And Jesus comes along. And something happened inside Jesus. It's this word splanknismoi, or taking pity, having compassion. But when I look at some of the translations, I find they're actually much closer to what Jesus was doing. They say his heart went out. What happens when his heart goes out? Is it just a feeling that he's having? Or is it an action that it inspires and motivates? Because feeling pity or even compassion without doing something about it falls short of seeing what it really meant to Jesus. And so I think of these verses which come frequently in the New Testament, not only of the Father and the Son, but the king who had servants and he forgave them. He forgave the man who owed millions of dollars because he splanknismoi, because he had compassion on him. And then I think of the crowds that came to Jesus, not only because of the healing, but the 5,000 and the 4,000. And this word is used the same. And I suggest it means not only his heart went out, but his heart broke. His heart broke. Sometimes when people come to tears, you say there's something going on. Be curious about it. Don't think you know the answers, but listen to the person. Ask them a question. What are your tears telling you? What do you think's going on inside? And as you listen gently, you'll find that there are significant things. And so when Jesus wept, what do you think was going on for Jesus? Did Jesus weep? Yes, he did when Lazarus died. We know that little verse, 2 words. Was he weeping for himself? Was he weeping because his friend was in the grave, in the tomb? I don't think so. He knew he was going to raise him. What brought Jesus to tears? It was his understanding that people knew very little of what death was about and resurrection. They came to death without hope. And his heart broke as he felt the pain of people who have no hope. And as Adventists, we have hope, don't we? We should have hope. And so Jesus' heart broke. If I think of him coming to the place where he wept over Jerusalem on that day when he came to Jerusalem at last, now accepting the designation of Messiah, of King, not in the way that they expected it, but he stood on the hillside looking out over the temple in Jerusalem and he wept. He wept because he looked into the future and he saw the destruction that was going to come to Jerusalem. And the people were asleep almost. They were unconscious of what their future held. And so he wept. And then he came to Gethsemane. And in Gethsemane, he groaned. He was agonizing. Perhaps not tears in that sense. But there was something deep going on inside Jesus. What was he groaning over? Was it what he had to go through? Or that people would be oblivious to what he was going through and why? And so he agonized in Gethsemane. And then he went to Calvary On Calvary, he groaned. What was happening for Jesus? Why did he die? Why did he die? Because of his wounds? No. Kevin, you know the answer.
Broken heart.
He died because his heart broke. What is his heart broke? It was broken for you and me. And when I see Jesus not thinking about himself in each of these situations, but thinking about those who were suffering and struggling, those for whom he came to give his life, then I see the epitome of God's love for me, of God's love for you. For he was not only feeling, but he was acting. And this word, splanknismoi, is actually about the movement of your bowels in the Greek. It's about gut-wrenching feelings. You understand that term, don't you? Gut-wrenching, where you're feeling so intensely because of what's happening. And so for Jesus, this significant word which is used only by or about him is translated pity or compassion, or his heart went out and finally broke. If we're to express gratitude to Jesus for what happened at the cross, gratitude is expressed as compassion, but it's not just a feeling, it's an action that takes something to reach out to the person who's struggling. And as we see Jesus weeping and what he did, and I ask myself the question, how does that work out in my life? How do I work out living in the Spirit in every detail of my life? And I can't answer that for you. I'm not about what you ought to do. I'm just asking you the question for you to answer this morning as I need to answer. How do I live my life of gratitude and compassion toward others? Last week, Pastor Arfie said, take this little book and give it to somebody. I said to him afterward, that's great, but I want to read it first. And I want to know how it works in my life. Because people don't want only to read a book. They want to know, how does it affect you? What does it do for you? And unless you're willing to share something of yourself with them, not to keep it to yourself, but to share yourself. Because real compassion is outward focused. It's not inward focused. And so we have to think about giving the book. I got through it by about Wednesday, and on Thursday I gave it away to a neighbour that I'm sharing life with. And the journey is great. One of them is a Christian and one is not a Christian. But they're lovely people. And I feel for them. And so I want to be engaged with them. Now, I don't have all the answers, but I need the Holy Spirit to guide me. And in that, living out what matters most is living out my gratitude to Jesus in compassionate ways. How does that work in my culture? Did any of you have a PlayStation 2 years ago? When did it come out? In the year 2000. It was the early sort of device on which you could play games. It was a console. And people enjoyed them. Nintendo, Xbox, and these days they're superseded. But at that time, it became very popular. Did you know that to make that PlayStation 2, they needed, as they do with most of our electronics, certain minerals. The one they needed back then was coltan. Coltan is a special mineral used in the processing. And in the Democratic Republic of Congo, there's quite a bit of coltan. being mined. But at that time, because it was so popular to have a PlayStation, the need for coltan shot the price up 10 times what it was originally worth. And as a result, the warlords in the Democratic Republic of Congo took over as many mines as they could, enslaved people to work in them, and drove them to death and starvation. Did you ever connect the two together? I didn't. Not that I had a PlayStation, but with my telephone. Oh, I had a bad week with my telephone last week. I didn't bring my Bible. I brought the Bible on my phone. Unfortunately, Daniel saved me. We're in the middle of church. It started to read the text out loud. And he reached over and he pushed the button to stop it. But you know, our devices in which we get so much information is the question, do we really need all this information? And what are we doing with it? So where does the rubber meet the road? I spoke to Jason last week. He'd been telling his father how to use AI. And as I thought of AI, I said to him, it must be pretty good. He said, you can save so much time. But you know, we've gone on a path where we've had labour-saving devices for so long, from washing machines and things that'll do this and do that. And now AI can be really helpful. I said, is there any downside? He thought for a minute. And he said to me, there is a danger that we might lose our ability of critical thinking. When somebody else does their thinking for you, what happens to your usage of your own critical thinking? And so I'm thinking about that today. All this data. What are we doing with the data? Well, we have to keep it somewhere. Where do we put it? This insatiable need we have for more and more data to meet our personal needs has got to be going somewhere. It's not really up there in the cloud. Where is it? It's in data buildings. How many of them are there in Australia? Do you ever think of it? There are 8 of them. They're building more. I have a relative who came up with the idea that he could talk his Japanese company into building data stations. And this year his budget is only $1.5 billion. That's a little bit of money to spend, isn't it? Because there's so much need for a place to safely, securely store this data that you and I might just flick our fingers and have what we want. But there are consequences. One of the consequences is they take a lot of energy to run. That is electricity. Australians having a bit of a struggle during peak times of having a good supply yet of energy. But how much of our energy goes into data stations? Currently, it's about 5 or 6% of what goes through the grid. But by the end of this decade, it will be somewhere between 12 and 15% of all the electricity in Australia is going to be gobbled up by data stations. Isn't that interesting? I read a lot of interesting stuff in this book. It's a great book to give people, but don't go and give it without you're prepared to tell them, how does Jesus work in your life? And I'm just inviting you this morning to have a heart. I think that's Jesus' invitation, to have a heart that reaches out to people, not about us, but about them. And so I could leave you there, and our time has run. And probably we'll stop the video. But for you who can give me another 5 or 10 minutes, I want to come to a little bit of analytical thinking, because that's what critical thinking is. Here's an issue, here's a problem. How does it work? Where's it not working? What can I do to make it change? And what am I doing with my Christianity? I have a cousin, lives in Melbourne. He's not in church this morning. Oh yes, he's a good Seventh-day Adventist, but he's down at Flinders Street Station and he's talking to people and he's giving out literature. I'm sure he'll be giving out a few of these. That's his passion. People, sharing his life with them. He said the hardest people to deal with Flinders Street Station are the Pentecostals, because they just want to know what you believe so they can tear you down. But the rest of his family are in church. Or not all of them. His daughter's in the hospital working this morning, showing compassion to those in need. But you know, in our world, and this place in particular, we drive in past the car park sign, Seventh-day Adventist Church. Now you can look at that from our inside perspective and say this is where Seventh-day Adventists meet. This is the place where we worship. This is the place where we study Scripture. This is the place where we consume. The king today, who's the king? Charles or the economy? My thought is the king is the economy, and consumerism is what makes it work. And when I come past that and I drive my car into the car park, I say, Graeme, you're part of this economy of consumerism. A nice new car, worth a lot of money, and I look at all the others. As I drove down my main street this morning, here were all the parents with their kids, and they're nearly all four-wheel drives and up to date. And so I'm one of the bunch. Part of this culture, which with its subtlety draws us to think about, what do you need? Well, you need the latest. You need all this information. That keeps our economy going. Are we consumers when we come to church? Or are we givers? My sense is that if we think about this gratitude, compassion dialogue, it's not about us, it's about them. It's not an inward focus, it's an outward focus. And so when I think of the people today, you and me, what's going on for you? I can't speak for you. I hardly know anything about most of you. I'd love to sit down and chat with you. But you know, we don't know what's going on inside people when they tear up and they cry. But is our heart being compassionate and feeling for them and actually doing something? Not just leaving it there, but doing something. As I think of passers-by, I watched a lady go past the church this morning. She was walking by and she looked in. I don't think she could see anything. The windows are a bit difficult to see through from out there. But how many passers-by actually take much notice of our sign? And what do they know about Adventist? If our sign out there said, here is a group of people who care and are willing to help if you had a need, what would it really mean to them? Would they be more interested? And rather than seeing us as a club or a cloister where we lock ourselves on the inside and then go home. I went with my son in his new Tesla to a trip, and we had to find a charging station, and he put it in and he charged it up. I don't think we need a charging station out there. Most of our cars are petrol driven. But I think we need a charging station in here where we get charged to go out and to be Jesus to the people. When Jesus is saying, have a heart, I believe he's saying, love the world as I love them, and I have loved you. If that's enough, then that will be plenty. I think sometimes Seventh-day Adventists are more worried about the Pope than they are about Ping or Putin or all the other totalitarian regimes which are going to be more coercive and controlling in the future. We need to have some analytical thinking about our prophecy and what it really means to us. But when we come to the missing piece, Jesus is the missing piece. And so as you go out today and you think of why we come to worship, is it just to have a pleasant time, to enjoy being with friends, or to be charged up to go out and show the love of Jesus in our gratitude and compassion?